welcome to this episode of Quakerism. In this episode, we're going to get to the heart of the rivalry that rocked early Quakerism, and that is the relationship between James Nayler and George Fox. So yeah, two big titans of early Quakerism, and they didn't really get on, at least not always. And so we're going to be looking at who they both are, why they're important to early Quakerism and to Quakerism more generally, and what led their relationship to maybe go astray, and what that says about early Quakerism as well, and what the results were. Who won? Probably most people will know who wins, I suppose. And did he win? Did he win? That's the question as well. So let's get into it. So in terms of their backgrounds first, I mean, they both are of an age. George Fox is slightly younger than James Nayler, though it's hard to necessarily know precisely which years, though I think it's James Nayler is the older. One is a Yorkshireman, so you know who my favourite's going to be, and that is James Nayler, whilst George Fox comes from Leicestershire. I'm not sure socially which one is higher up, so James Nayler was a farmer, a freeholding farmer, whereas George Fox came from a weaving family. Another difference might be that James Nayler fought in the English Civil War, so he fought for Parliament, and I suppose from that was maybe more exposed to the types of radicalism that was going through the English army at that time, in a way that George Fox, I suppose, wasn't. Both kind of received calls to go out and seek the truth. So James Nayler famously was told by a heavenly voice to leave his plough, leave his family, and go out and become an itinerant preacher, which he does. George Fox has a slightly more tortuous route. He goes out in the 1640s to find truth. He basically feels that the Church of England isn't speaking to his condition, and he's going out in order to try and find it. So they both basically end up on the road, and ultimately do meet up, and they have a lot of success. For example, in Yorkshire, they meet up with other seekers and antinomians and start this movement which, moving on to Pendle Hill and going on into Lancashire, starts the Quaker movement as we begin to see it in the 1650s. But as I've talked about before, in order for Quakerism to truly grow, they had to go to London. They couldn't stay in the north. And so they both Fox and Nayler went to London in 1654, and it became quite apparent that James Nayler was better at fighting Quakerism's corner, I suppose, especially against maybe the more urban elites or the more academically minded people than George Fox was. And because of that, George Fox went back up to Swarthmore Hall, and James Nayler stayed in London in order to keep on preaching and to keep on spreading the Quaker message, and he was highly successful. Now, at this point, you kind of have a leader in the north and a leader in the south. So you've got George Fox leading and spreading Quakerism from Swarthmore Hall in the north, and you have James Nayler as in a growing London base. And if you have to think about, well, which one's more important, anyone would tell you at that time it's going to be London. And so the argument that James Nayler is actually the leader of Quakerism was seen by many to be the case. Now, into this story comes a very intriguing woman, as it always does, but when in fallouts between, colossal figures. But it was, well, I don't believe it was romantic in any way, but Martha Simmons caused quite a bit of an issue. She loved James Nayler. She thought he was amazing. Did she think that he was probably the son of God? Maybe. I mean, she seemed to be like, all out James Nayler fan. If this actually was a Simon Garfunkel kind of thing, she'd be. Which one would they be? Ooh, I hadn't actually thought of that. I would say that George Fox would be Paul Simon, and James Nayler would be Art Garfunkel. Anyway, that's irrelevant. She'd be all out with the Art Garfunkel t-shirts and go to every concert and that sort of thing. That's fine. You're allowed to have your supporters, and more supporters the better. The problem was that I suppose you could see it this way, and I think maybe James Nayler saw it this way, is that basically disciples from George Fox, Edward Burrow and Francis Howgill, you can see them that way, I suppose. I can see it. I'm playing it like that. Came to London, and they basically are setting up and organising the London Quaker body as is being done in the north. And Martha Simmons is outraged by this, seemingly, and her group of Nayler fanatics are going out and they are disrupting Howgill and Burrow whilst they're doing their meetings and stuff, like being very raucous and very sort of intimidating as well, I suppose. So this is where the split happens, because George Fox asks James Nayler to say, can you disavow yourself of Martha Simmons? She's causing all this trouble, and say that you don't support this, and that'll be great, please. Would really help us. And James Nayler does not. And they're big personalities, both of them, in very different ways. And we talk about that, in terms of their differences a bit later on as well. But just to sort of give a layout of the story, this is kind of the crux of the problem. I suppose James Nayler maybe thought that he was doing a really good job in London in terms of converting people and arguing the case of Quakerism. Then, on the other hand, George Fox is trying to organise things and get a national movement going, and obviously that comes with a certain amount of organisation, and sees that James Nayler isn't really doing that, and so they're kind of stepping on each other's toes a bit. So I think this kind of came to a head when George Fox came to meet James Nayler in prison in Exeter. Maybe this was where James Nayler apparently rose someone from the dead. Maybe, who knows? But anyway, they meet in Exeter prison, and it seems to be that there's a difference that's emerging between their two theological styles, and I'm not sure whether or not it's completely true at this point, but I think we're kind of getting there. Basically, James Naylor's style is a bit more edgy, I suppose, is the word. He's a lot bigger on sort of performance theology. Is that the world is a stage and it's there to sort of reenact and to make manifest what one is experiencing inwardly. So in terms of like just keeping very quiet and keeping to oneself versus going full naked in terms of early Quaker levels, he's probably more on the naked side. Whether he actually did go naked, I don't know. Whereas George Fox is, trying to organise these things and trying to bring this thing together, but is also quite keen on not shaking the boat too much when it came to the authorities. I mean, on high. I think he's quite, obviously he got arrested an awful lot as well. So it's not necessarily he's saying that, we shouldn't, kick up a fuss and make a scene. But I think when it comes to really like high game, if Parliament's looking your way, that's not what they want. And he feels that George Fox is kind of creating the wrong sort of attention. So there's stuff with kissing that kind of gets all a bit weird. I'm sure maybe Mark Russ would be all over this with links with the Holy Kiss, maybe, I don't know. But basically it all gets a bit petty. Basically George Fox offers James Nayler his hand to kiss. I think Nayler says no, thank you. But then George Fox then says, "Well, you should be kissing my boots," and obviously James Naylor's offended. So it all just doesn't really go too well, and so not very good terms that they parted on. I think the traditional historical view is that James Nayler is kind of like the radical one, and George Fox is always trying to organise things. But I mean, if you read James Nayler and George Fox, they're saying rather similar things, especially in some of the things that certainly would have outraged people of the time. Especially if you look at the idea of perfection or perfectionism, so the idea that people can be perfect and so free from sin. I'd say that George Fox was way more on that than James Nayler was. He and Margaret Fell, they were like, even to the very end, they were pretty much saying that people, if you keep following the inward light and keep adhering to it, you can be without sin. This was something which other Quakers were starting to get rid of. I mean, if Robert Barclay, for example, kind of says, yeah, not really possible, maybe theoretically, but not really. And so I don't think you can simply argue that one was more radical than the other. I don't think it's necessarily that. I think it was simply a case of personalities clashing. I think maybe George Fox did have a more kind of trying to keep things together, having maybe a wider vision, and maybe James Nayler maybe living more in the spirit and being a bit more radical in that way. But he was a very good orator. He was very good at convincing people about Quakerism. He was very good at garnering new followers. So he's certainly one that you want on your side, but I suppose where are you going to go? Are you going to go down a route which is based down the freedom of the spirit, or you go down a road which is maybe more systematized? And had the Bristol affair not happened, I don't really know which way this would have gone, because I think at this point, I mean, the way that spoiler alert, I think if people had to say today who's the founder of Quakerism, they would say George Fox. And I think even in my introduction to this channel, I say George Fox is the founder. But I think had you not known that, I think how I'd put it out at the moment, it seems both are very, very capable and very, very influential. You could throw other people in there as well. I'm focusing on these two because I think they are the most important. But, George Keith could be very much in there as well. Or John Perrott. Lots of people could have this moniker of founder of Quakerism. But anyway, back to these two. The Bristol affair happened. So James Nayler wanted to show, as I was saying before, he wanted to show outwardly what he felt inwardly, that Christ was within him, spiritually, not actually. And he decided he was going to pretend to be Jesus, dress up as Jesus, ride a donkey into Jerusalem with people waving palms and things on, singing "Holy, Holy, Holy," all that sort of stuff. And which obviously really offended everyone. And he had a horrific trial, he had horrific punishment, but wasn't executed, which was nice. But I mean, he died pretty soon after, so that pretty much took him out of the game, really. He'd been discredited, not only because it obviously was a step too far for the time. He was it gave George Fox a good opportunity, considering their relationship obviously wasn't so good, to kind of wash his hands of him and say, well, that's not us, and allowed Quakerism to go down a much more acceptable style of behaviour that it had certainly hadn't in the early days. In the end, though, there is kind of a reconciliation, but not really one that's, I think, full-hearted. So he does get on his knees and ask for forgiveness from George Fox, but obviously, whilst that's all very well and good in terms of trying to reconcile this relationship, obviously George Fox is still furious because, the movement, which he certainly, I believe, feels is his, has been sort of really put on really rocky ground because of James Nayler. I don't think the forgiveness which he does accept is really maybe very genuine, but also by doing that, it does kind of give a certain hierarchy towards George Fox. I feel like I'm putting George Fox in a really bad light here. I think everyone's got a soft spot for James Nayler. I think everyone understands that what he did for the time was really bad. I think it's the slightly freer spirit aspect of his outlook of what Quakerism could be, this radical Quakerism that people talk about. I think that he sort of symbolises that nowadays, as opposed to George Fox, who, arguably, maybe because of how James Nayler reacted or acted, he had to kind of start putting in sort of the toning down measures of Quakerism to allow it to survive. So you could argue, well, maybe Quakers could have been a bit more radical than they were had James Nayler not done what he did and making George Fox do that. One could also argue that maybe he was going to do that anyway. I'm not putting one or the other. I think what I'd really like to show, though, is that I think it's too often assumed that George Fox is the is the founder of Quakerism. I think there was an episode in Our Time on Radio 4 which looked at George Fox pretty much as the founder of Quakerism, and as I said, I think that it's not as clear cut as that. I think probably just to finish off then in terms of how this all ends, and another reason why George Fox maybe is seen as the leader is because he lives longer. So James Nayler does not live for much longer after he's let loose from prison. I think it's just a year, pretty much. So he dies in 1660, whereas George Fox lives until 1690 or something like that. So he's got an extra 30 years to sort of cement his position. And I think by the end of it, I don't think any Quaker is really necessarily bothered in a leader, as in like there must be a head figure. But I think it's pretty clear by that, certainly by the end of his life, that he's cemented his position there as the top dog. And evidence of this would be that George Fox's journal is one of the first to be published, and things like that. So he obviously has managed to create this reputation. So there we are, a very rocky relationship at the very beginning of Quakerism, kind of looking at some of the really important and different influences of Quakerism there, and looking at what the futures might look like. Ultimately, it was the Foxian way that won out. I think a lot of Quakers look back at James Nayler and with fondness, and with and really enjoy reading his works, and maybe look to think, well, what would happen if this had been the other way around, or if something else had happened that meant that James Nayler was the only one to carry the mantle, so to speak. But as I've said many times before, I do believe that probably very unlikely that Quakerism would survive today had it not been to George Fox. So I do obviously have a very high respect for him for that. So I'm hoping to do a couple of other sort of vignettes of other important Quakers throughout that early period of Quakerism. So from the beginning up until 1721, that sort of era. So we've got lots of people, really interesting people to get into. Obviously, I think these are the early Quakers, so these are the people who I think Quakers even today are the most interested in when talking about, if we're going to be doing videos on the history of any Quaker, I think people want them to be the early ones. So I'll do a good couple of those as well. So look out for the next one. See you again soon.
Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.